Hi, my name is Min Song, and I'm a professor of English at Boston College, where I specialize in the study of Asian American literature, and increasingly in the study of the environment and the arts. My first book, Strange Future, Pessimism and the 1992 Los Angeles Riots, was published 15 years ago, and it considered the ways in which the riots or uprising affected how writers, filmmakers, and dramatists in the rest of the decade imagined the troubles afflicting the United States. Here's how I characterize what it felt like to be attentive to the tensions that gave birth to what happened in Los Angeles in the early 1990s. I wrote in the introduction that this was a moment with little optimism about the future, a general sense of futility about the possibility of positive change, and as such, a vulnerability to arguments for greater state repression as necessary defense against the triptych sign of national decline, the diminished economic fortunes of a white middle class, the daily misery of poor urban Blacks, and alien invasion. Let me try to break down what I meant by that triptych. In the early 1990s, the sociologist Saskia Sassen, who was maybe one of the most prominent sociologists at the time, wrote a very important book called The Global City. And she observes that debate among economists before the 1990s centered on the question of whether or not wealth inequality was increasing. By the 1990s, that debate was settled, and the debate became more about what was causing wealth inequality. Certainly, when we look back at this decade, it's clear that a process that had begun at least a decade before had begun to accelerate as the poorly defined and largely white middle class grew ever smaller, and everyone else's economic fortunes also deteriorated except for a small group of people. Certainly, we see that the African-American community continued to struggle economically and in many other ways as they were disadvantaged by structural racism. A final feature of the 1990s that I considered in my book was the enormous influx of non-white immigrants, especially from Asia and Latin America, but also from Africa and the Middle East. The country was well on its way in the 1990s to a demographic upheaval, as white people were destined to no longer be a numerical majority in the United States. All three of these factors, it seems to me, created the perfect condition for arguments in favor of shrinking the size of the state and increasing the punitive nature of the country's laws. And these very same arguments prepared the ground for a situation in which the redistribution of wealth upward into fewer and fewer hands is made possible by the outright coercion of those who might object. For someone like me, who is interested in literature and the arts more generally, such thinking led to the following questions. How will we respond to the losses created by such coercion? How will we mend the divisions endlessly created by the arguments without at the same time succumbing to their logic? And how can we participate in the shaping of the social changes that are everywhere manifesting themselves in a destructive manner? In other words, I was interested in how literature and the arts in the 1990s turned to the uprising in Los Angeles as a way of thinking through these questions. And when I reflect on what I wrote in that book, and I reflect on how these questions were addressed by writers and artists and filmmakers and dramatists, there's one text in particular that remains in my mind as being exceptionally prophetic. It's a scene from Paul Beatty's early satirical novel, White Boy Shuffle, which appeared in the mid-1990s. Looking back in my book, I was surprised to discover that I buried this scene in an endnote, a reference to the scene in an endnote. But it's well worth thinking about today. It takes place about 2/3 of the way in, when the uprising is at its height. The owner of a local grocery store in Los Angeles, a woman named Miss Kim, who is both Asian American and African American, begins to pass out Molotov cocktails as she shouts, "Look, goddammit, you saw the video. Remember, Latasha Harlins, burn my fucking store down. I feel better. Rodney King, Rodney King, Rodney King." The novel continues. The crowd refused. Miss Kim was too well liked. Maybe if she had been 100% Korean, they'd have busted a few windows just for appearance's sake. Holding one of her makeshift grenades, Miss Kim lit the oil rag fuse and strode to the front of the store. The crowd surged to stop her, and she held them at bay by waving the torch in their stunned faces. Then she wheeled and sent the bomb hurling through the glass doors. A few folks tried to douse the flames with garden hoses, but Ms. Kim cut their hoses in half with a Swiss Army knife, then went looking for the police to place herself under arrest. Fast forward to the present and shift the scene to Minneapolis. A police officer has just killed George Floyd, while several other officers keep angry witnesses at a distance. The city is full of protesters, and in the evenings, some become violent. A Bangladeshi Indian restaurant, which happens to be located near the 3rd Precinct police station, is set on fire. The owner, Ruhel Islam, says, "Let my building burn, justice needs to be done." He goes on to say, "I'm going to continuously promote peaceful ways and nonviolent movement, but our younger generation is angry, and there's reason to be angry." There's a reason to be angry. We should not shy away from strong emotions. Strong emotions reveal a clarity of understanding, and such understanding allows us to suspend our self-interest, if only for a moment, to consider the interest of others. It allows us to put others before ourselves. Putting others before ourselves, I believe, is a non-transactional way of being in the world that lays the foundation for new communities to be born. And so I want to conclude by just saying, thinking about Paul Beatty's novel in relationship to something that has actually happened helps us, I think, to expand the range of our imaginations, to see what's possible, to think about how the divisions that separate so many people who are struggling in their very different ways, for very different historical reasons, might still find a way to find common cause with one another and to form new kinds of communities. Thank you.